right, welcome back. This is the Something Adventure podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. This is part 2 of my conversation with Jonathan Abrams, who has done a lot of things. One of them, a long time ago, was founding Friendster and starting social networking. This is part 2 of the conversation I had with Jonathan about his conversation, it's very meta, with people at the startup podcast from Gimlet Media. So, if you haven't heard it, go back and listen to part 1. Otherwise, welcome back. This is the Something Adventure podcast.
Friendster's not unique. We've seen this play out. Dysfunctional boards, parades of different CEOs, mergers that don't make sense. We've seen these things happen at other companies. And I think that at companies like Facebook and Google, if the founders hadn't retained control, the investors in those companies might have actually sabotaged themselves by trying to replace those founders early on with some sort of, Scott Sassa-like person and wouldn't have made the billions that they did.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the better bet is to say, look, I don't know about this Mark Zuckerberg, but it's his show. So his show is going to work or his show's not going to work. But his show as directed by 5 guys, with a different idea every week is certainly not going to work.
And that could have easily happened. So, one of the things people don't remember is that Sheryl Sandberg was the 3rd person in the number 2 slot at Facebook. So if instead of 3 number 2s, they had replaced Zuckerberg with 3 other people, then Facebook would have gotten through four CEOs in a row very quickly in a very similar way to Friendster. And the results of that would have probably been very bad.
Right.
So was Zuckerberg a perfect CEO? No. But, there may be no perfect CEO.
Right.
And certainly just going through all sorts of different CEOs is kind of a mess.
Yeah, and I know in terms of the politics, I know people who went there and left, they hated it. They hated Mark Zuckerberg, and people who went there and stayed and loved him.
Yeah.
And the thing that happened was all the people who were there weren't trying to undermine him. They were on his side, and the people who weren't on his side just went somewhere else.
And we had just endless undermining at Friendster, and it wasn't just me. I think that's another thing that's not really addressed in this podcast is how other people were undermined. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at the history of Friendster, the way you were treated, or if you know what happened with Johannes Larcher, or you understand the situation of Taekwon, his situation, there are patterns there. There are patterns of the way people were treated and undermined that is not just about me. Yeah. There's some consistent patterns there. For better or worse, if it had been the Jonathan show with people there who were just behind me and my vision, clearly it would have gone better than what actually happened.
It would have to. They kind of hit and this is something I actually I'll tell you in a second, but MySpace and Facebook emerging. Mm-hmm. They talk about that, and I think they talk about an offer to buy Facebook or, which, probably.
That was another thing that I don't think the podcast got exactly right, because one of the things they failed to sort of point out is that even though Scott Sassa was this big shot executive who'd come from NBC and companies like that, Friendster at the time was a Series A company. We had raised $13 million that I had raised. And, one of the funny things also of the story of Friendster is that throughout 6 companies in 6 years, you and I raised together 100% of the funding. Each of us raised multiple rounds of funding. And all the other 4 CEOs brought in by the VCs collectively raised 0. They just spent the money we raised. So, Scott Sassa didn't raise some huge new round of funding. So, the idea that we had a large amount of cash to offer to buy Facebook was not correct. And the idea that Friendster was worth billions of dollars and could then put forward a compelling stock offer was also not correct. So the whole Facebook, trying to buy Facebook thing was kind of nuts. I mean, it was just a mistake. And I guess this is a mistake of bringing in a big company guy into a company that's still very sort of risky and entrepreneurial.
Right.
Is we were not a big company. We did not have the resources, the currency to be buying other companies at that time.
Right.
So from what I recall is they offered Zuckerberg something like 10% of the stock of Friendster to buy Facebook, which of course was an uncompelling offer.
Right.
It was never going to happen.
Yeah.
The other thing they mention is that we had talks with MySpace and Bebo and all that kind of stuff around that same time. Do you remember that?
I mean, this is one of the things I think. They're sort of like, you talk about everything to everyone.
Yes,
exactly. So did we talk to MySpace? Probably. Did somebody say, hey, should we merge? Probably. Did somebody send a deal, memorandum over? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree. I think that of course we were having talks with all sorts of people, but the idea that like there was a real strong conversation about us buying MySpace early on or them buying us, I don't think that was like that. It was like that serious.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was really weird was there was something specifically about that where Lisa says, when discussing the idea that we were trying to sell to all these companies, maybe one of them can help us with our technical issues. And she says it using the word "are," but it's not a quote. This is she's saying it, I guess, supposedly saying that we were thinking that.
Yeah.
But that's a weird one. I mean, the idea that that Friendster buying MySpace or Bebo or being bought by MySpace or Bebo had anything to do with fixing the technical issues.
Yeah.
Like that I don't even understand how that would have worked.
Yeah. And my takeaway in listening back to the podcast, because I stayed for years, became the CEO and all that, once MySpace and Facebook emerged and even Bebo, at that point it was kind of too late. Like it's one thing to be dominating and winning and owning the world. It's another thing to be like catching up from behind. And
I mean, look, once we had bad technology that we replaced with worse technology, the best people on the team, many of them had left. We went from being this hot company to this, tainted company. We had debt. We just all these problems. The likelihood of really ever being able to turn that around. I mean, there's not a lot of stories in the history of Silicon Valley, aside from Apple, which is obviously a data point of one, where those kind of turnarounds work. With regards to Facebook, again, one thing that's not in the podcast is that, my immediate reaction upon Facebook, and again, it's not like it was really one of those things where somehow we were shocked and weren't tracking these things, but was that we should, Facebook was in 2 colleges, and I said, okay, let's just roll out Friendster College and put it in 40 other colleges and try to, launch that in like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But of course we couldn't. We were, we had management team problems, we had cultural problems, the engineers and the product people and the sysadmins weren't getting along, and we were wasting all our time with those partnerships that we should have never done, and I wasn't in charge, and so our ability during that era to really make the right new product moves wasn't there. But that would have been the move. The move would have been, while we saw Facebook and saw it working at 2 colleges, to then roll out Friendster, Friendster Cornell and Friendster Northwestern and Friendster Princeton and boom, 50 other colleges before. And there was a window where that theoretically was possible.
Right.
But Friendster was just not at that point in the time able to execute on much of anything.
Right. And so at this point, I feel like most of the podcast happens, and here they kind of just move kind of quickly downhill. The Philippines part, they bring up. And the issue was that, my theory is because it started in an area of the world where there's a lot of Filipino expats, which is the Bay Area, that Friendster became very big in Southeast Asia relative to everywhere else. Now, given the time zones and when people use it, that meant that the traffic for Friendster was peaking at 2 a.m. in California, basically. And they kind of indicate that maybe we should have turned off. And it's a difficult to monetize area. So
I think that's another part of the show that was a little bit inaccurate or sensationalized. So again, we early on did have data about the geographical distribution of our users, and we saw it growing, and it wasn't some big revelation that happened in one sort of pivotal moment.
Right.
And one of the weird things, in addition to the fact that I was interviewed for so many hours for this thing, we also got a lot of fact-checking requests, and then even though we did, there were things that were in the podcast that are inaccurate that they didn't fact-check us. So it is kind of like weird how they take the time to do fact-checking, but it ends up still not being thorough. And there's other cases where there's things I talked about with Lisa. So we talked about the Philippines thing, and I guess one of the reasons why maybe you don't hear from that much of me in the 2 episodes, is that a lot of what I kept doing was saying no. I kept saying no.
Right.
It wasn't
not true.
It's not true, or it wasn't as dramatic at that, or it's not as simple as that, or it's more nuanced, or it wasn't in quite some poignant moment as that, and sort of pushing back on these like rumors and fake stories. And when it comes to the Philippines and Southeast Asia, I pointed out the problem was not that Friendster was popular in Southeast Asia. Facebook today is the dominant social network in those countries, and that's not a problem. Right. The problem was that Friendster had all these problems that were not being fixed. They were causing us to lose our position in America and other more high GDP countries and more sort of important countries. And we basically lost America, which was, where we had started and invented the entire thing.
Right.
And then basically all we were left with was Southeast Asia, which, was not where we were headquartered and not necessarily where the top American acquirers are excited and not necessarily as lucrative for advertising. But the problem wasn't that we were big in Southeast Asia. The problem that we lost in the US.
Right.
And there's this sort of narrative that just like the fakester nonsense, that one of the problems of why we lost was because Southeast Asia grew so big, sort of unexpectedly. And it's like, no, that's not really it. The problem was that we had mismanagement, we didn't fix the technology, the site was slow for years, and the users fled in America, and then that was all we were left was this weird Southeast Asian thing.
Right.
But so the root of it is not that we were popular in South Asia. The root of it is that we messed up and our American users left.
Right.
That's the real story. That's the real problem. But again, this whole oh my God, somehow Southeast Asia, and that's what happened. It's again one of those not really accurate narratives that for some reason people just find interesting.
Yep. And then they get to the point which I was concerned the whole podcast would be, and this is kind of the last I remember of it, where they ask you about regretting anything, how do you feel, which is like, how do you feel? You could have been worth $1 billion.
Well, the reality is, you're saying you were worried the whole podcast was going to be about it, but I kind of feel like our whole tapings were about it. So as we discussed, I spent a lot of time talking to them, and they asked me about this more than once. And at one point, I think I told her that it was kind of feeling like a bad therapy session. And hopefully what we're doing right now is like the good therapy.
Right.
But the reason, why I said that is because I found it really draining doing the tapings. So not only was it long, but it was kind of very draining because I kept feeling like she just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing for things that weren't there, for me to confirm stories that weren't true, or for me to give her highs that weren't really accurate. Because like for example, when everything exploded and we were getting all the press coverage and I was on TV and all that kind of stuff, I wasn't really enjoying that.
Right.
That's not the kind of stuff I enjoy. I'm a computer nerd, and when I was coding the original prototype of Friendster, I was having fun doing that. I mean, that's why I do this kind of stuff. I actually enjoy that. Right. So when it was actually taking off and all this hype, that was actually not that fun for me. But of course, that's not what she wanted to hear. Right. She wanted to hear all these emotional, candid, vulnerable stories, many of which just didn't exist.
Right.
And then there was actually a lot of stuff I told her about the fake protest, about the fakesters when I was giving a talk, or about other things that that I thought were good that didn't get in. So this whole stuff about me not being a billionaire, we talked about that on more than one occasion. At one point, she asked me if I was haunted by what happened at Friendster.
Wow,
and I pushed back and I said, come on, look. This was years ago. I have moved on with my life. I have become an American citizen, started multiple companies, invested in many companies, started a family. I mean, I have moved on with my life. I'm not sitting on the side of the road going, oh, Friendster.
Right.
And it's such a ridiculous question.
Right.
And the only way in which I am haunted by it is by journalists who are repeating that narrative.
Yeah.
So it's the only way I'm being haunted by it is by Lisa asking such a ridiculous question as if I'm haunted about it. And when Jim Scheinman talks about Jim's supposedly wondering how I feel about all this and does it eat away at me, my guess is that Lisa prompted him to say those things, not to be, attacking Lisa, but the reality is that was like a kind of a recurring theme in our interviews. And you and I know Jim well.
Yep.
I see Jim often at VC events that he and I both go to.
Right.
I just saw him at a VC conference last week. And we talk about a lot of things. We talk about Nuzzel. We talk about VC. We talk about all sorts of things, maybe our families. But he doesn't constantly say, "Oh my God, Jonathan, how are you doing? Are you still haunted about Friendster?"
Right.
He does not constantly ask and wonder that.
Right.
So I do kind of think that this was something that was sort of overly dramatized in the podcast. Again, and I guess it's not a surprise.
Yep.
But there was another point in which we were talking about this that I said something to Lisa that I actually thought was kind of funny and should have made it in.
Right.
And I said, "Look, Lisa, part of why I agreed to do this is because I'm a fan and I listen to this show, the Startup Podcast." And I said, "You, in one of your recent seasons, had an episode where there was a guy, an entrepreneur, who thought his company was going to be stolen by his investors, and he burnt down his yogurt factory and went to jail."
Right.
And she started laughing. But I wasn't making that up. That was really a previous episode of this same podcast. And I think the point is, put this into perspective.
Right.
Yes, it was very frustrating what happened at Friendster. But you and I are, still alive, still in the game. We've got a great company. We've got great investors. We were App of the Year.
Yep.
And, we're working on cool stuff. And yeah, it's incredibly frustrating what happened at Friendster, but at least I'm not in jail for burning down my yogurt factory.
Right.
And she didn't put that in, but I thought, because I don't think she wanted me being contemplative and having perspective.
Right.
But I do, and that is how I've moved on.
Right.
By putting these things into perspective. So
Right.
I'm not haunted, and we do put these things into perspective, and it did suck, but she's had other guests on her show
Right.
that clearly are way more haunted
Right.
by their business ups and downs than we are. So I just kind of feel like this.
Yeah.
It's a little overdone.
Yeah. Well, and I in the end, Chip, the customer service guy we meet at the beginning, has a really, I thought it's a nice piece about him getting in his car and driving away. I thought that was very radio dramatic, but I liked it.
Well, I mean, it does show the loyalty and the care that the early team members had
Right.
for the company, which I think is definitely true. Although, again, after that happened, Friendster still existed for 5 more years?
Yeah, right.
So again, it's a little overdramatic.
I know, but yeah.
Because it's not like Friendster was shut down that night.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, and so what should people, is there anything for people to take away? Sometimes when people go, "What's the lesson of Friendster?" I'm sort of like, I don't really have one. I mean, yes, don't get rid of your CEO. Mm-hmm. But it's a lesson for people who have the fastest growing internet company in history. So if you're starting,
saying it's a situation most people won't be in.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like if it's like when people compare themselves to Steve Jobs. It's like, yeah, you're not Steve Jobs. That's right.
It's a very irrelevant comparison for pretty much anybody.
Right. So with Friendster, I'm sort of like, there is a lesson there, but I don't think your startup that doesn't have any traction can use it.
Yeah, but I mean, I still think, look, I think Naval Ravikant, who is an investor in Nuzzel and founded AngelList and, brilliant guy, and Nivi on the Venture Hacks blog years ago, but of course years after Friendster, because I wish I had, had the benefit of reading those things back in the Friendster days. And you have to remember, there was no Y Combinator or AngelList or Venture Hacks back when we were making the mistakes we made at Friendster. They wrote about something like valuation is temporary, control is forever, and that's true. And I think that is a lesson. And even if it's not a hyper growth company like Friendster, I regularly have entrepreneurs come to me, even these still today, for advice, who've been pushed out of their company. And usually what ends up happening is the new CEO doesn't do a good job either, and oftentimes the company fails.
Yeah.
That's even if it's not an exponentially growing service, I mean, it's still, removing the entrepreneurs from entrepreneurial companies, is often a mistake. Not always.
Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't be 100%, but
Right.
it shouldn't be as prevalent as it once was.
Right.
So I think that's a lesson. I mean, I think also there's lessons about just sort of credentialism.
Oh,
And and it's tough because look, we love to say that Nuzzel is backed by Andreessen Horowitz and Lowercase and Softtech and Homebrew and are fantastic investors and brag about it. But the reality is that it's a kind of a crazy thing that we you brand money. And
Right.
I think, there is a bit too much hype
Yeah.
in the industry. But, back to the control issue, another thing that Lisa mentions very much towards the end, which is another thing that's sort of glossed over, is the fact that the company who bought Friendster sold the patents that we filed to Facebook for more than they paid to buy Friendster.
Right.
And I think that's, like, when you say control is forever, it can sound bad. It can sound like, oh, this entrepreneur is just an egomaniac and he doesn't want to, share control and he's just making silly decisions. And that's, I think, not really understanding the point. I mean, the point is, like, your every strategy you have, like our IP strategy, where we filed patents that probably could have been worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. None of that mattered when we were not in charge,
Right.
and somebody sold the company for less than the patents were worth,
Right.
and just completely failed to extract the value
Right.
to Friendster's own shareholders of those patents.
Right.
So, it's an example where if you don't have control, you can do a lot of correct things, and then someday have all of the things that you've done smart not count because you've lost the power and a lot of dumb things can happen.
Right.
So I think that is definitely one of the lessons.
Yep. It's an amazing tale. So what do you, anything else? Have we covered this thing?
I think I have other things. I mean, one of the things I was disappointed at, so in the season where they talked about the American Apparel guy, like he got to talk about, in addition to all his scandals, his sort of like comeback story, his new company.
Yeah.
And even in the episode about the guy with like the slap bracelet,
Right.
he was talking about his next project. And I was kind of disappointed that they didn't talk a little bit more about Nuzzel.
Right.
And, the funny thing was, she says, oh, and it aggregates content from social networks, including, of course, Facebook, and sort of
clever.
like over-exaggerating the connection with Facebook. And if you really want to talk about Nuzzel and Facebook, what would be probably more relevant would be to talk about our Facebook Messenger bot, which we recently launched. But, one thing is, all of this started because Chris Sacca was an early guest in their show, which is why I listened to the show. And I thought, and I actually suggested to Lisa, get Chris Sacca back on the show. And as an independent sort of industry expert, ask him, like, why did he invest in Nuzzel? And did he think, oh, I'm not going to back those guys because they failed at Friendster? Or did he think the opposite? And I thought, like, that would be an interesting way to connect the past and the present and bring back Chris Sacca, who's a great, guest, and have him be able to talk a little bit about Nuzzel. And not in a dumb way.
Right.
But instead of all this nonsense about, am I haunted or whatever, like, tell the truth about what I'm doing today, that we are still innovating, working on a great company, and an investor like Chris Sacca is involved. Another example is one of the co-founders of Gimlet Media is a Nuzzel user and actually tweeted that he uses it every day.
Right.
And I thought, hey, how about, because remember, like, one of the things that made the original season of this podcast so successful was this sort of self-referential, very candid stuff where they would like interview each other and stuff like that. And I was like, have that guy talk about, say, oh, well, you've heard, you use Nuzzel every day. Like, did you know that this was created by the guys who created Friendster back in the day?
Right.
And that, that could be kind of, funny and interesting. I wasn't expecting like a blatant 20-minute Nuzzel ad, but I thought those are contextual, relevant ways to link the past and the future in a way that still like has a point to it and has storytelling value and connects to connects Friendster, Nuzzel, and the Gimlet Media family.
Yeah. Well, and I think it is interesting that you have this company Nuzzel that is a wildly like beloved, among. I mean, obviously it doesn't have the scale of Facebook because nothing has the scale of Facebook, but for hundreds of thousands of the most influential people in the world, they love Nuzzel. And the odds that you've done that again after doing Facebook are pretty astronomically low. I mean, Stuart Butterfield at Slack has founded a couple companies, and Steve Jobs, did a couple. Like, that's a pretty rare thing that you have two companies. Like, Nuzzel's insanely successful, just not compared to Facebook.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that's also lost amidst this conversation about Friendster versus MySpace or Facebook is that even if Friendster hadn't been mismanaged and didn't achieve its potential, we still started something that was bigger than one company.
Right.
Friendster inspired an entire industry.
Right.
And, Dig and Flickr and Yelp and a whole bunch of social media companies were, started, because of this sort of boom of Web 2.0 and social media and all that kind of stuff that Friendster started. So the reality is, even without this whole Friendster versus MySpace, Facebook stuff, there is a bigger story than just one company that Friendster was part of.
Right.
And then, with Nuzzel, I think the fact that there's a connection back to, one of the co-founders of Gimlet Media, or Chris Sacca, one of their own investors that sort of kickstarted their show in the first place. Those were good hooks for them to, to have a chance to talk about Nuzzel in a way that wasn't gratuitous, but was contextual. And like I said, in other episodes of their own podcast, they've talked about entrepreneurs, past companies, but then also had a little bit more about what they were doing now.
Right.
And I thought without that, it was just kind of weird to just have so much focus on this haunted stuff, and especially considering it's so long ago. Like the American Apparel thing was a few years ago. I mean, the Friendster stuff is like 14 years ago.
Right.
So I thought that was just a little weird.
Yeah, they were pretty clearly trying to bring the story to that end. You're being like really successful now doesn't really.
No.
But you started a hedge fund, which is doing really well. Yeah, they don't want to hear that. That's not the story. They'd much rather that you were in the gutter somewhere.
I guess. And, the other thing was I thought, like, your parts in the podcast were also kind of weird. Like, they kept saying you were an early employee and didn't really, explain that you were, an early investor, advisor, helped me out, became the first member of the management team. You were CEO, you were CFO, you were CEO. Right. Melissa was the VP of marketing of my first company. Chris Lunt was not just an engineer; he was like an engineer director. So for some reason, there were certain people whose titles were emphasized, and then other people whose sort of positions in the company, for some reason, were sort of minimized. Yeah. I didn't really understand why that was.
Yeah, that didn't bother me. I did notice. I mean, I think the story.
It doesn't really bother me, but I still found it puzzling. I don't really know why it wasn't consistent.
Yeah.
You were more than just an early employee.
Right. It was all a very strange experience, both doing it and listening to it. Yeah.
And, like I said, there was a lot of fact-checking, and I think I found at least 9 things that were inaccurate, most of which were not that big a deal.
Right.
But, still, here's an example of one that I just thought was kind of silly. There was one where she talks about the press and the engineers. And again, it's kind of funny because it's not like a quote, but it says that, where is this? Oh, well, here's another one. Do you remember, this was funny. Chris said something about how our office was unwashed and had a funk of a big dorm room.
Yeah, that, I don't, I get that idea. That just wasn't Friendster.
I really don't think.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't think that was true. None of us, I lived a few blocks away, but I didn't sleep under my
no one ever
desk.
Did.
Well, supposedly they do in some companies, but I never understood the point of that. And that's kind of I heard that kind of story many times about Facebook. That Facebook had that dorm room vibe,
and they do red Solo cups, and I mean there's a little younger, more partying going on there, and
right. But so that was a weird one.
Yeah.
But then later Lisa says, every time Jonathan would get another media request, there was a collective groan amongst the small team of engineers because they couldn't handle more traffic.
Yeah.
And that's again one of those things. I didn't say it. It's not a quote. She didn't fact check that, but I don't think that's true.
Right.
And not only is it not true, but it actually doesn't make sense. The funny thing is, many of these things that are not true oftentimes don't actually make sense. So first of all, every time I got a press request, I didn't rush over to the engineers and tell them about it.
Right.
Because it might be a press request I wasn't going to respond to. It might be a press request that ended up being very minor in coverage. Right. It might be one where I talked to them and then they ended up not being interested or whatever. But the idea that every time I got a press request email, I ran over and bothered the engineers who were busy by telling them about a press request?
Right.
Why would I have done that? So that just makes no sense at all. The other thing is it completely mixes up the cause and effect. So the reality was there's a lot of people who think if they get a lot of press coverage, they're going to get a lot of growth for their startup.
Right.
That is extremely rare and unlikely.
Right.
And in the case of Friendster, it's the other way around. We were getting all the press because we were going exponentially.
Right.
Because you were a journalist you're 30 years old, you're in New York, and you get 20 friend requests from people, and you're like, what the fuck is this? I'm going to write about this.
Right.
It was our exponential growth that was causing the press coverage, not the other way around. And if we weren't getting the press coverage, the exponential growth would have still kept happening, which meant the engineering problems were going to happen regardless of the press coverage. And most of the time when we did get press coverage, because we were already growing exponentially anyways, it usually didn't even cause a blip.
Right.
So, so that's just another one of those things where I'm just like, huh?
Yeah.
And again, it's kind of funny that they sent us all these emails fact-checking things and then still had things in here that are just, where did this come from? It's not true. I didn't say it.
Yep.
So that's kind of weird.
Yep. Well, I overall, I thought they told the story, given how journalists can be and given our state of fake news these days, I thought they told a pretty good arc.
I agree it was pretty good. I don't think it was fantastic, and I don't think that it was 100% accurate, and I don't think that people learned that much deep stuff from it. But I still think it was an entertaining package. Yep. And like I said, if you really got into the details of sharding versus sands, and how startup board composition of votes versus preferred and common. Look, if you got into the weeds on all that kind of stuff, obviously that would make a podcast that would appeal to a much more narrow audience than the entertainment that Gimlet Media provides. So I get that. And I think they did do a good job. But one of the funny things is Lisa said, and I'm going to quoting her from the transcript again, "Today we're taking a page from business school and presenting a case study on Friendster. What went wrong and what can we learn from it?"
Yeah.
Because after you and I listened to the first episode, and we were first talking about it, you were saying that you thought it was pretty good. And I was like, it was okay, but, not as good as it could have been. And, and not, doesn't really explain the thing doesn't really explain what happened. And you're like, look, it's not a business case study. And that's true.
Right.
But I think it's hilarious that she then basically herself in the podcast basically positioned that way.
Yep.
And actually used those words.
My theory on that is that they started with that and then they couldn't quite pull it together, but they found a more interesting story and they didn't go back and take it out and say, oh, this is just a crazy story we're going to tell you.
I guess. I mean, there were a few other things in here that were not accurate. None of whom are super annoying. I mean, super important, but I still just don't 100% understand some of them. I think she says that Chip was the only employee to serve under all the different CEOs.
Right.
And I think we've realized there's at least 4.
Yeah.
So the idea there was only one is way off.
Yeah.
And I don't even know why that was important. Why even mention that?
Right.
But I guess they thought that incorrect fact sounded dramatic to illustrate how chaotic it was that we went through these CEOs, which is true.
Yeah.
But then they illustrated that with with the fact that actually isn't true.
Yep.
So, like I said, it was entertaining, but I think it could have been a little bit more accurate.
Yep. What else you got?
Well, I think we already talked about the board stuff. We talked about the team. Let's see. We talked about the people. We talked about that crazy glow phone stunt with Alexander Graham Bell.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's see. We talked about the fact that Chip was not the only one. Oh, one thing we didn't talk about was Scott Sasso.
Oh yeah, I was surprised he did it. Scott Sasso was a very famous executive, ran NBC Entertainment. He was one of the CEOs along the way. The first one who came, third one, I forget how the numbers all work, but I'm surprised he even agreed to do the podcast.
I don't really know what he got out of it. And, I guess I'm not going to go into his recent scandals, but they are a hell of a lot more interesting than, the one time for one San Jose weekly alternative free newspaper, they had 2 girls stand next to me in a picture. But for some reason, they still felt inclined to include that to try to make it, seem exciting. But, I don't think they really covered a lot of what really happened with Scott. And one of the things that I really remember about his tenure and he was one of the six CEOs. He was one of the ones that was there the longest.
Right.
Was how much time we spent on deals, partnerships with AOL and MTV that never actually happened. And that was just another, yet another example of, part of why we weren't fixing the technology and focusing on that is because we weren't focused, and we were, instead of just getting out of our own way and fixing the problem that was impairing a naturally exponential growth that was being artificially impaired, we were, wasting all this time. And the MTV deal never happened. The AOL thing, which was some sort of integration with AIM and Friendster that I never even understood what it was going to do, it never actually happened. The interim CEO we had before, Scott Sassa, the fact that he was not really there most of the time, and I was like still signing the checks and stuff like that. Right. That was a whole weird situation that was not really addressed. That was sort of glossed over. And then when Scott was hired, she talks about how there was a expectation that he was going to turn Friendster into a business.
Right.
And that's another one of the myths of Friendster, is that we didn't have a business model, or the other CEOs turned it into business. And the reality is, prior to the venture funding, we had already done deals with multiple ad networks and had ads up on the site.
Right.
It may not have been fantastic or generating a ton of revenue, but the idea that we didn't have a business model or didn't have any revenue at all is not accurate.
Right.
And the other CEOs never really created a different business. But one thing that is mentioned in here, I can't remember if it was Chris Lunt or Jim Scheinman or Chip, but somebody did point out that that the focus on revenue ahead of growth, that was a huge mistake. Right. And I definitely agree with that.
Well, and trying to invent things. I mean, ad revenue works like Facebook, Google. Like, it's not, we didn't have to try to figure out how to staple Craigslist onto it to make money.
Yeah.
Which I think was one of the many ideas we went through.
One other thing that I thought was kind of ridiculous was the stuff with Tila Tequila.
Oh, yeah.
Because, and they gloss over the fact that, they mention her being kicked off of Twitter for Nazi stuff, but they gloss over the porn stuff. And I think one of the reasons why she was kicked off of Friendster or had her account suspended was for posting, I think, nudity. Right. And MySpace was, very liberal and lenient sort of, about that stuff. But just like the whole Fakester thing, I mean, the idea that kicking off this person had anything to do with Friendster's problems is another one of those false stories.
Right.
And they've got the guy from MySpace quoted saying that, Friendster was too dictatorial and they didn't allow, dogs and all this kind of stuff. And the funny thing is they completely contradict this. So at the very end, of the podcast, Lisa says that when you look at the king of social networking world, Facebook, it didn't build on the MySpace model with personalization features and an anonymous profile. It's simpler, cleaner, more like Friendster. And she basically points out at the very end that we were right, and that all the stuff that about Tila Tequila or fake profiles or some of the silly features that MySpace had weren't right, didn't really win.
Right.
But then in the middle of the podcast, she brings all these things up as, again, as these, supposed possible reasons why Friendster failed.
Right.
But then contradicts herself at the very end, pointing out that Facebook's success proves that all that stuff is actually wrong.
Right.
So I thought it was just weird that she, brings these things up, this, all this Tila Tequila distraction and nonsense.
Right.
At all, but then later just contradicts it.
Yep.
So I thought that was, that was kind of a silly thing. But I guess at least they end on an accurate note.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, should we wrap it up there?
Yeah.
We should wrap it up with Nuzzel. You've started another amazing company. They didn't talk about it. What should people know about? What do you think people should know about your latest company?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, they mentioned it, very, very briefly, but it would have been nice to, to point out that the founder of Gimlet Media himself has said he uses it every day, and Chris Sacca uses it and invested and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, I think that it would have been nice to have had a little bit more about Nuzzel and what we're doing at Nuzzel, and it's also, I think, also interesting. I don't even know if they mentioned this. Did they even mention that you work at Nuzzel?
I don't think they did.
Right. So she's like, oh, and Jonathan still works as an entrepreneur in the social media space. It's
right.
like, But again, like, and it's kind of funny. Like, I think your whole role at Friendster is sort of minimized.
Yeah.
And then when you get replaced as CEO as well, that's kind of glossed over, even though that's actually, that same pattern reoccurring. But yeah, they don't even mention that we work together again, which is kind of funny. And that we even have another person here at Nuzzel who was from Friendster.
Yeah, my theory on that is that they kind of ended the story after, like, the last year's wasn't part of the story, really.
Yeah.
Like, that's why I think.
Yeah, they did gloss over it. And also, like, the stuff about Larissa was a little weird. Like, they sort of give her credit for removing all the dumb integrations, which I think was something that you really did later, and sort of give her credit for the the friend tracker, which I remember Lisa even sent you an email fact-checking on, and you pointed out that
filed a patent on it.
And who really invented that? So that was another weird one. Yep. But yeah, in general, the fact that you and I are work together at Nuzzel, kind of odd that wouldn't be mentioned, because that's you and I, you were at Friendster a long time. You started the company really with me. You were there way after I was pushed out.
Right.
You went through ups and downs similar to how I was treated, and now we're working together again. So that was kind of a weird thing to omit, and like what's Jonathan up to now that we're still working together.
Well, they should have ended it there.
Yeah.
Oh well. All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
And
and
I
everyone
guess
should check out Nuzzel, by the way.
The big lesson to Friendster: don't burn down your yogurt factory. Don't go to jail over your startup. But if you get pushed out of your company and the company isn't successful as it should have been, and you go on and you start new companies, like, that's still not so bad compared to being up in jail because you burnt down your yogurt factory.
Burnt yogurt factory.
And so if people now want to do a podcast critiquing this podcast, where can they listen to that podcast?
Oh yeah, they should. We'll have to do one of those. Well, this has been great. Thanks for doing this.
Of course. This I think was hopefully the good therapy.
Excellent. All right. Well, this has been the Something About Your podcast. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.